My name is Catherine Ellis. I'm 66 years old, and the last words I heard before my brother slammed my face into the marble floor of our grandmother's house were, "You're under arrest for fake passports usage." And that was the moment I understood something I'd refused to believe for years. That the boy I once protected with my own hands had been waiting a long time for the perfect moment to get rid of me completely, with no shame and no mercy, while the rest of the family stood by and let it happen. They say that betrayal from strangers is painful, but when it comes from someone who once held your hand across a cemetery lawn when you buried your parents, someone who grew up under the same roof at the same table with the same lullabies in the air, the pain isn't just sharp, it's bone deep, and it changes the way your heart beats for the rest of your life. As my body hit the ground and the marble pressed into my cheek with its cold, unyielding surface, all I could see were the legs of our grandmother's dining chairs and the hem of her favorite linen tablecloth drifting in the breeze, as if the house itself didn't know what to do with the silence that followed. Thomas's knee was in my back, hard and merciless, his hands tight on my wrists as the cuffs clicked into place. I felt the metal bite into my skin and heard my own breath catch, somewhere between fury and disbelief. But I didn't say a word. I didn't scream or fight because I knew no one in that room would come to my defense. Aunt Loretta stood by the sideboard with her martini glass frozen mid-air, eyes wide but empty, while Cousin June gasped softly and took a step back, careful not to spill her drink on the rug. And my grandmother, dear God, she just sat there, clutching her chest with one hand and gripping the edge of the table with the other, her lips parted in a soundless moan as her world collapsed around her without warning. I was dragged out of the house like a criminal, like someone who had crept in off the street to rob the family blind, and not a single person called out my name or asked what was going on. It was as if, in that single moment, I had become invisible, or worse, disposable. And Thomas, with his polished badge and well-practiced scowl, had made sure that no one would question his version of the story. It didn't matter that I had lived in that house for nearly 30 years, caring for the very woman who now sat too stunned to speak. It didn't matter that I had given up jobs, friendships, even love, to be there when no one else would. None of it mattered now. All that mattered was what he said, what he claimed, and what he had orchestrated behind my back while I was too trusting to see it. The holding cell was nothing more than a cracked concrete box with a steel bench that sent shocks through my spine every time I tried to shift positions. The air smelled of old bleach and something damp, like a basement that hadn't seen sunlight in years. I sat there in silence, my wrists raw and red, my thoughts circling like vultures around a carcass of confusion. They said I had used fake documents to claim part of my grandmother's property, that I had forged papers, lied to officials, and stolen money that didn't belong to me. They showed me copies with my name on them, forms I had never seen, signatures that looked close enough to mine to make doubt slide in like a shadow beneath the door. I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know where to begin. I had never filed anything. I had never even held a passport, let alone a fake one. My whole life had been rooted in that house, in that neighborhood, with routines and grocery lists and doctor visits. And now, suddenly, I was being painted as someone who had traveled far and wide under false names, moving money and manipulating systems. It was absurd. It was impossible, but it was also happening, and no one seemed to care whether I believed it or not. The detective who spoke to me didn't look much older than my niece. She had that rehearsed flatness in her voice, the kind that comes from seeing too many people lie through their teeth. She asked me questions I didn't understand, showed me photos of forms and transactions, pointed at signatures with a red pen, waiting for me to crack. But all I could think about was Thomas's face, the way his jaw had clenched when I tried to look up at him, the way his eyes burned not with sadness or regret, but with satisfaction, as if he had finally accomplished something he had worked toward for years. And that's when it started to sink in. The creeping realization that this hadn't been a sudden reaction or a misunderstanding. This had been planned, designed, built piece by piece behind closed doors while I was busy folding laundry, baking casseroles, and checking blood pressure monitors. Thomas hadn't just wanted me out of the house, he wanted me erased. And what better way to make sure no one believed a word I said than to turn me into a criminal first? I spent the night on that bench, knees pulled to my chest, trying to breathe through the panic that crawled up my spine like ice water. My thoughts were a mess of memories and questions. But somewhere beneath the wreckage of humiliation, fear, and rage, I found something steady, something sharp and clear. I wasn't going to let him win, not like this, not without a fight. He may have taken my freedom for now, but I still had something left that he didn't expect. Time. And I was going to use every second of it to find out how he did it, who helped him, and how I could make it all come crashing down. Because Thomas didn't just take my name. He took everything I'd spent a lifetime building. My dignity, my reputation, my trust in the people I loved. And when someone takes that much from you, there's only one thing left to do. Take it all back. Sitting in that freezing cell with my back aching from the metal bench and the weight of everything I had just lost pressing down on my chest, I closed my eyes and let my mind drift to the only place that ever brought me comfort. My childhood, or at least the version of it that hadn't yet been tainted by betrayal, money, and the slow erosion of trust. I needed to remember who I was before Thomas rewrote the story of my life with lies and forged ink, before the world started looking at me like I was something to be locked away. Because if I didn't hold on to that truth, I feared I'd lose the last pieces of myself that still felt real. We grew up in a small brick house in the east part of town, where the porches were wide, the mailboxes rusted, and neighbors left pies cooling on windowsills without fear of them being taken. My mother was a school teacher with soft hands and eyes that always looked tired, and my father worked at the local hardware store until the day a truck ran a red light and left both of them cold and still on a stretch of wet highway in the middle of November. I was 23, just old enough to be more daughter than child, and Thomas had just turned 18. A golden-haired boy with a cleft chin and a smile that could get him out of anything, which, looking back, should have been my first warning. After the funeral, it was our grandmother who stepped in. Eleanor Livingston, a woman made of lace and steel with perfect posture, garden gloves, and an iron will wrapped in rosewater perfume. She took us in like it was nothing, pulled the bedsheets tight and wiped the tears from our cheeks, and told us in her quiet, firm voice that we were still a family and she would make sure we stayed one. And she did, in the only way she knew how. But even then, the seeds of difference had already been sown. I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who learned to cook her meals and match her curtains and take her to the doctor when her knees started to swell. Thomas was the bright one, the favorite, the one who made her laugh when she didn't want to, the one she said reminded her of our father, though I never saw the resemblance except in the way they both seemed to take and take without asking. It wasn't that she didn't love me, I think, in her way she did, but her love came with conditions, invisible ones I could never quite meet. I was always just a little too plain, too serious, too practical. I didn't light up a room like Thomas did. I didn't charm company with effortless chatter or win awards at school or chase girls around with that mischievous glint in my eye. I stayed home, I studied, I cleaned. I didn't cause trouble, and maybe that was my mistake, because quiet loyalty is easy to ignore when someone louder is always shining beside you. By the time we were in our 30s, I was still living in that same house, caring for our grandmother after her first fall, while Thomas had gone off and made a name for himself in law enforcement, first in a small town, then in state services, climbing up the ladder one title at a time until everyone started treating him like some kind of local hero. He sent postcards with smiling faces and brief notes, gifts wrapped in glossy paper for holidays. He rarely came home to celebrate, and whenever he did visit, Grandma lit up like it was Easter morning, even if he stayed no longer than a lunch break. I never resented him for that, not out loud, but somewhere in the quiet corners of my heart, I started to feel it. The ache of always being second, even when I was the one who stayed, the one who made sure the lights stayed on and the medications were sorted and the bills got paid. After her second stroke, Grandma asked me to help with the papers. There were files to go through, accounts to review, and I assumed, foolishly, that she wanted me to be part of it, to finally trust me with something more than grocery lists and pill schedules. But just a week later, Thomas arrived with a thick folder and a carefully rehearsed smile, told her not to worry about the stress of legal language, that he would handle the details, that he had friends who could make sure everything was secure. She looked over at me and said nothing, just nodded. And I stepped back, told myself it didn't matter, that I was just happy she was safe, and that whatever he was doing must be for the good of the family. That was the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it yet. I should have paid more attention to the little signs. I should have asked why certain envelopes stopped arriving. I should have questioned the new faces at Grandma's door. Bankers, notaries, advisors I'd never seen before, who always smiled too wide and never made eye contact with me. But I was tired. Always tired. And it was easier to believe everything was fine than to confront the possibility that it wasn't. One afternoon, I found an envelope tucked between old recipe cards in the back of a kitchen drawer, a letter from an estate lawyer I didn't recognize, dated 3 years earlier, referencing pending revisions to Grandma's will and joint ownership of properties I didn't know existed. I read it 3 times, felt my stomach twist, but instead of bringing it up, I tucked it back into the drawer and convinced myself it didn't mean anything. I didn't want to stir the pot. I didn't want to upset her, and maybe, deep down, I didn't want to know. But Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. He came back more frequently after that, but always with a purpose. Documents in hand, phone calls to take, meetings to attend. He would sit in Grandma's study with the door closed and emerge an hour later, with a satisfied smile and fresh copies in his briefcase. I assumed it was all routine, paperwork that needed to be updated, plans for, after she was gone, things I wasn't supposed to worry about. And when she started confusing names and forgetting dates, I chalked it up to age, not realizing that her fading memory had become the perfect camouflage for everything he was rewriting, while I stood just outside the room with a tray of tea and warm towels. The day she passed was quiet, just the 2 of us in the room. She squeezed my hand and called me "darling girl," and I kissed her forehead and told her I'd be all right, even though I wasn't sure it was true. Thomas arrived the next morning, dressed in crisp black with eyes already dry, and took charge of the arrangements like the dutiful grandson everyone believed he was. I watched him, numb and wordless, as he moved through the house, like it already belonged to him, and maybe, legally, it did. That was 6 months ago, and now, here I was, accused of forging documents to claim something I had apparently stolen through a scheme involving fake identities and international transactions. There were witnesses, they said, statements, evidence, a paper trail as thick as a phone book. But I knew I hadn't done any of it, which meant only one thing. Someone had. Someone who had access to Grandma's records, someone who had control over legal files and signatures, and enough knowledge of the system to pull it off without raising a single red flag. Someone who had been planning this for years. Thomas. He hadn't just removed me from her legacy. He'd planted a version of me that could be erased without a trace. But I wasn't gone yet, and I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I didn't know how I was going to prove it. I didn't know who I could trust, but I knew this. I may have been the forgotten daughter, the one who faded into the wallpaper while the golden boy soaked up all the light, but the shadows remember everything. And sometimes, when the lights finally go out, it's the one in the dark who sees the truth most clearly. It's one thing to be betrayed by your own brother, but it's another to sit across from strangers who have already decided you're guilty and watch them sort through your life like it's a pile of stained laundry, each piece held up under fluorescent lights and labeled with words that don't belong to you. Fraud, forgery, theft. Until you start to wonder if maybe the truth you've always known about yourself was never enough to matter in the first place. They processed me like I was some career criminal, fingerprinted me, photographed me under a flickering bulb that buzzed with static like a fly trapped in a jar, handed me papers filled with numbers and codes and charges I could barely pronounce, and sat me in front of a lawyer who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else but there, sipping from a paper coffee cup and clicking her pen as if my entire life was just another file on her already overloaded desk. She spoke in short, clipped phrases. Bail hearing, evidentiary review, possible federal escalation. And the more she talked, the more I realized she wasn't really looking at me. Not as a person, not as someone who had just had her world ripped out from under her, but as a name on a sheet of paper with a case number and a red flag stamped in bold. There was a binder with over 100 pages, all of it supposedly tied to me. Photocopies of passport applications, property transfers, financial authorizations, real estate filings with my name scrawled across them in ink that looked eerily like my own handwriting. There were offshore accounts, they said, opened under aliases that linked back to my social security number and emails that originated from addresses I'd never seen, but were traced to devices in locations where I had apparently traveled, even though the last time I'd left the state was to take Grandma to a specialist clinic across the county line. None of it made any sense, but it didn't need to, because someone had made it make sense. Someone had spent months, maybe years, building this picture of me as a manipulator, a liar, someone who had carefully and systematically siphoned away part of the family estate using deception and paperwork. And in the middle of it all was Thomas. He wasn't at the station anymore, of course. No, he had made his dramatic arrest and disappeared back into his perfectly curated world, where every gesture looked noble and every move seemed professional. But his fingerprints were all over the case, not in the files, but in the strategy. I could see it clearly now, in the way the evidence was structured. The timeline assembled just so, the traps set in places where only someone who knew me intimately could have predicted I'd be too distracted or too trusting to notice. He had used my routines against me, my patterns, my habits, even my own handwriting. There were even logs of phone calls I had supposedly made to out-of-state offices, and when I said I never spoke to those people, the detective simply looked at me like I was either lying or too far gone to know the difference anymore. And the hardest part was that I couldn't prove otherwise. I had no lawyer of my own, no savings set aside for something like this, because women like me don't expect to wake up one day accused of a federal crime by someone they once shared a bunk bed with. I had no documents to contradict the lies because the lies were the documents. I had no way to explain how someone else could have gotten access to my ID or my personal information. No break-in, no theft, no missing wallet, just the slow, quiet bleeding of trust over years until everything that made up my legal existence was no longer mine. I was released under conditional supervision 2 days later. An anonymous third party had posted bail. A woman, the court clerk said, who didn't leave a name but provided a check that cleared faster than I could even process the fact that I wasn't going back to that cell. I walked out of that courthouse with a borrowed coat draped over my shoulders and a file of instructions in my hand, my knees still stiff from the cold and my heart so heavy it felt like it was dragging behind me with every step. And yet, under the confusion and the lingering fear, there was something else stirring. The first flicker of something sharp and alive, a sense that someone out there believed I was worth saving, or at least worth watching long enough to see what I'd do next. The woman never came forward, but 2 days later, I found an envelope wedged under the front door of the tiny rental where I was staying, a one-room unit behind a rundown hardware store, paid for by a friend of Grandma's who still remembered the days when I used to bring her peach pies in the summer. The envelope was plain, no return address, just my name written in block letters that looked like they'd been traced slowly, carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and an old photograph, one I recognized instantly, even though I hadn't seen it in years. It was from the backyard of Grandma's house, the summer she turned 80, the last time all the cousins had been together. In the photo, Thomas was leaning over a table with a stack of documents in his hand, talking to a man I didn't recognize at the time. But now, staring at his face, I realized he was the same notary who had signed off on half the papers being used to accuse me. The sheet of paper had only one sentence typed on it, centered in the middle. "He forged everything while you were out picking up her prescriptions." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just a single silent bullet aimed at the wall of lies that had been built around me. And for the first time since the arrest, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't know who sent it, or why they were helping, or whether it was even real. But it didn't matter. It was a thread, and I was going to pull it with everything I had left. I spent the rest of that day going through old boxes I had begged the attorney to release back to me, personal effects, Grandma's journals, a few household records that hadn't yet been claimed by the estate. There were names I hadn't paid attention to before, invoices from firms I'd never contacted, strange gaps in the timeline where papers were filed during times I remembered being at home, cooking, cleaning, waiting for medication refills. It was all there, scattered, incomplete, but real. And now I wasn't just a woman on the outside trying to clear her name. I was a woman who had been framed by someone who thought she was too tired, too quiet, too broken to fight back. Thomas had made one mistake. He assumed that because I had been invisible for most of my life, I wouldn't know how to see what others missed. But I had spent years watching from the edges, learning how things worked, while no one noticed I was listening. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I had everything to gain. And I wasn't going to stop until every lie, every signature, every stolen page was dragged into the light, where he couldn't twist it anymore. He had taken my freedom. Now I was coming for his legacy. The house looked smaller than I remembered, as if grief and absence had pressed in on the walls since the last time I stood at the foot of the porch steps with my hands full of groceries and 1,000 little responsibilities tucked under my arm like folded laundry. But now everything was still and cold and uninviting. The windows shut tight like eyes that had seen too much, the flower beds choked with weeds, the curtains drawn as though the house itself was holding its breath and waiting to see who I would be now that the world had changed. I had no key, of course. The locks had been changed within a week of my arrest, but the side door near the garage still had the old rusted hinge that never quite closed properly, and I slipped inside with a strange combination of guilt and quiet defiance, like a woman sneaking into her own past not to steal anything, but to prove that it had been hers all along. The air was musty, thick with the smell of dust and lemon polish, and I could still see the faint rings where Grandma's teacups had rested for years on the side table in the sitting room, right next to the old lamp with the cracked porcelain base and the fading family photo she never let anyone move. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing it in, the scent of time, the weight of memory, the ghost of myself moving through the shadows. And then I began to search. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, only that I had to find it before Thomas realized I wasn't hiding in some rented room licking my wounds like he expected, but walking right back into the one place he thought I'd never dare to touch again. I started with the file cabinets in Grandma's study, the ones he always claimed were a mess and insisted on handling himself. But they were too neat now, too curated. The drawers almost sterile in their organization, each folder labeled with mechanical precision. No clutter, no notes in Grandma's shaky cursive, no annotations in her favorite green ink. It was too clean, and that's how I knew he'd gone through everything, stripped it of her fingerprints, sterilized it of anything human, But he had never been as careful in the attic. I climbed the narrow stairs with my heart pounding louder than my footsteps, each creak of the wood beneath me sounding like a warning, like the house itself was bracing for what I might find. It was dark up there, the light bulb above me flickering weakly as I pulled the cord, and for a moment I just stood in the low, dust-thick air, staring at the stacks of boxes and bins and yellowed garment bags that had been untouched for years, if not decades. I moved slowly, lifting lids, peeling back newspaper, reading labels. There were receipts from decades past, greeting cards, an entire box of knitting patterns I remembered Grandma swearing she'd finish one day. And then, in the back corner behind a stack of old curtain rods, I found a shallow wooden crate marked with masking tape in her handwriting. Just one word: private. Inside were ledgers, handwritten lists, a flash drive taped to the bottom of an envelope, and, most telling, a sealed folder with my name written across it. I held it in my hands for a moment, stunned, my fingers trembling as I peeled it open, and what I found inside was both exactly what I needed and more than I knew how to process. There were copies of letters, some to lawyers, others to banks, that indicated Grandma had, in fact, been planning to split her estate differently than what Thomas had told me. There were memos she had written to herself about discussing power of attorney with me, not him, and there was one note that stopped my breath entirely. Catherine doesn't know what Thomas has done. Must talk to her before fall. It was dated just 3 weeks before her second stroke. I sank to my knees on the attic floor, the papers fanned out in front of me like a trail of breadcrumbs I had never known to follow. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something inside me shift. Not just hope, but certainty. Like the floor beneath me had finally stopped tilting and I could stand again without falling. That's when I heard the front door open. My whole body froze, every nerve snapping to attention like a live wire. And I heard footsteps, heavy, confident, unhurried, crossing the tile of the front hall. My heart leapt into my throat, my mind racing through every possibility, every hiding place, every locked door. But I had no time to move, no time to plan. I switched off the attic light and crouched low behind the old cedar chest, holding my breath so tightly my ribs felt like they might crack, and the footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just below me. There was silence, and then I heard him. It was Thomas. He was talking on the phone, low and casual, saying something about needing the file from the attic and making sure everything was shredded, and I could hear his voice drift upward like a knife slicing through the air, steady and relaxed, completely unaware that I was already up there, holding the very things he thought he had erased. I curled myself tighter behind the trunk, my palm covering my mouth, praying he wouldn't climb the stairs, praying the hinges wouldn't groan, praying the attic wouldn't betray me. Seconds passed like hours. He shifted his weight, his shoe scraping lightly against the wood at the bottom step. And then a car horn blared from outside, 2 sharp beeps, and his phone voice changed, annoyed now, distracted, and after a beat of hesitation, he turned away and walked back toward the front door. I heard it open, then close. The silence returned, and I sat there, frozen in place, sweat cold on my spine, not moving for what felt like eternity, until I was sure he was gone. When I finally made it out of the house, clutching the folder against my chest like a shield, I didn't even realize I was crying until I felt the tears hit the top of the envelope. Not from fear, not exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of it all. The danger I'd been in, the truth I now carried, the narrow edge I had just balanced on without falling. He'd almost caught me. But now I had more than a theory and a gut feeling. I had her words, her handwriting, her plans, and a copy of something Thomas didn't know still existed. And for the first time, I wasn't just trying to survive. I was getting ready to strike. The morning I woke up with the folder still clutched against my chest and the stale attic dust still clinging to my hair, I knew something had changed inside me. Not the panic that had followed me like a shadow since the arrest, and not the grief I had carried quietly for months as my name was dragged through dirt I never stepped in, but a sharper, colder clarity that settled into my bones like the first breath of winter after a long, choking summer. Because now I had something Thomas didn't expect me to have: proof. Not just vague suspicions or gut feelings or whispered warnings, but real, physical, undeniable proof. Not yet enough to convict him, maybe, but more than enough to raise questions in the right rooms and pierce the polished image he had worked so hard to build around himself like armor. I knew better than to rush. This had to be played carefully, not like an emotional outburst, but like a quiet hand on a chessboard, each move calculated to expose without tipping the whole table. Because Thomas had always been the one who controlled the narrative. He had the badge, the connections, the polished voice, the practiced smile, and I was just the forgotten sister with an arrest record and a trembling voice, unless I could shift the weight of truth in a way that would make even his supporters pause long enough to look twice. I reached out to the one person who had silently helped me already, the anonymous woman who had posted my bail. I didn't know her name, but I remembered Grandma mentioning an old friend from her teaching days who had later gone into private practice as an estate advisor. I found her number in one of Grandma's journals, tucked between pie recipes and weather notes, and when I finally worked up the courage to call, a calm, cautious voice answered. And I didn't have to explain much, only that I was in trouble, that I had found something, and that I didn't know where else to turn. We met that afternoon in the back room of a quiet library outside the city, where the shelves still smelled like old paper and the windows fogged over from the late autumn rain. I handed her the folder and waited, my palms damp against my skirt, as she flipped through the documents with the slow, precise fingers of someone who had seen too many families fall apart over signatures and secrets. When she finally looked up at me, she didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and told me she'd make a few calls. By the next day, she had arranged a meeting with a journalist she trusted, someone who had once exposed a probate scandal in the northern counties and had been itching for something with teeth again. I met him in a diner that hadn't changed its curtains since the 70s, and while the world outside moved past the fogged windows without noticing me, I told him everything. From the moment Thomas pressed my face into the marble floor to the night I crouched behind a cedar trunk while he paced below me on the phone, confident and unaware. I gave him copies of Grandma's handwritten notes, showed him the forged documents, the notary signatures that had appeared in other fraud cases, and the sealed statement from her estate file that confirmed she had intended to revisit her will. I didn't ask him to believe me. I just asked him to look. The article ran the following week. It didn't name him outright, but it didn't have to. It described a respected public official whose sister had been accused of fraudulent inheritance claims under suspicious circumstances, noting inconsistencies in estate documentation, irregular filings, and sudden shifts in financial control coinciding with the elder's declining health. It was enough to stir interest, enough to rattle confidence. Within 48 hours, a state auditor had reopened several files. A local affiliate picked up the story. And Thomas, for the first time in his perfectly managed career, was no longer being greeted with applause when he walked into a room. I heard from a former colleague of his that he snapped at a reporter in a parking lot and that an internal review had begun quietly under the surface. He hadn't been charged, not yet, and maybe he never would be. But I had forced him into the light, and I wasn't finished. Armed with everything I now had, I submitted a formal petition to the court to re-examine my arrest, citing new evidence, undue familial influence, and potential abuse of power by an interested party with legal authority. I didn't expect immediate results, but I didn't need them. The seed had been planted, and now it was only a matter of time. I stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse after filing the paperwork, the wind curling around my coat like a whisper, and for the first time in months, I felt taller. Not because anything was over, but because something had finally begun. I didn't know where this would all lead, whether justice would be clean or messy, or if the system would even care. But I knew this much. I wasn't invisible anymore. And Thomas, for all his power and polish, had finally started to crack. And if I had to be the one to pull the rest of that facade down brick by brick, then so be it. I was no longer the quiet sister, the shadow, the dutiful caretaker. I was the storm he never saw coming. The courthouse lobby smelled like cold stone and paper dust, and as I walked across the tile with the echoes of my own footsteps following close behind, I knew that whatever happened next, I had already crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. The moment when silence ends and the truth begins clawing its way out, not because it's ready, but because it refuses to stay buried any longer. I was called to testify in a preliminary review hearing, not as a defendant, but as a petitioner, and for the first time, I stood in front of the bench with my spine straight, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had lived through fear already and found it survivable. My attorney, a woman with kind eyes and a mind like a scalpel, laid everything out methodically, ruthlessly, document by document, connecting timelines, showing inconsistencies, highlighting the sequence of decisions that place power solely in Thomas's hands during a time when Grandma's health had been visibly deteriorating. I watched as exhibits were placed, as names were read aloud, as my brother's carefully curated image began to peel away like paint on a damp wall. But the court is not the movies, and justice doesn't always move in clean, satisfying arcs. 2 weeks later, I received a notice. The district attorney had decided not to move forward with criminal charges, citing insufficient direct evidence of intent to defraud. Despite the mounting pressure and media scrutiny, the civil review of my own charges was still pending, but there would be no public trial for Thomas, no handcuffs, no courtroom scene where I'd watch him answer for everything he'd done. For a few days, I felt the kind of hollow defeat that seeps into your bones, the kind that makes even victories taste like ash, because I had fought so hard, peeled back every layer, dragged myself through humiliation and grief and confrontation, only to find that the system didn't want to look too closely at one of its own. I sat alone in that rental room, surrounded by folders and memories, and wondered if maybe this was the best I could hope for. Not justice, but survival. Not punishment, but exposure. But then the second letter came. It wasn't from a court. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was from the Regional Ethics Board, a confidential review committee tasked with evaluating internal conduct within law enforcement branches. Apparently, one of the auditors reviewing my case had forwarded materials anonymously, and now Thomas was under an administrative review for ethical violations, abuse of power, and undisclosed financial entanglements. The board had subpoenaed his financials, and it turned out his name was linked to a shell company registered in another state. The same company listed on several disputed estate transfers. And just like that, everything began to unravel, not in a dramatic courtroom scene, but quietly, behind the scenes, where real accountability often begins. Within 3 weeks, Thomas was placed on indefinite leave. Within 6, he was forced into early retirement. And within 8, the state formally reopened the investigation into my charges with a new team, one not connected to my brother or his old colleagues. But the true ending didn't come with a gavel or a news headline. It came the day I stepped back into Grandma's house, now legally mine, officially restored to me by court order, and walked through the hallway with no fear of who might be waiting inside. The rooms were quiet. Sun spilling across the hardwood floors, dust catching in the light like gold, and I didn't feel victory exactly, but something softer and stronger. Reclamation. I sat at the old dining room table with a fresh cup of coffee and spread out the photos I'd salvaged from the attic, the ones that had survived, the ones that still told the truth, and I felt the past settle, not like a weight, but like a quilt finally being laid over a restless bed. A month later, I received a letter from a nonprofit legal foundation offering to sponsor a public education campaign about inheritance fraud and elder exploitation, using my story, with my permission, as the starting point. I agreed not because I wanted attention, but because if one woman heard my story and saw the danger signs before it was too late, then all of this, every bruise, every night spent wondering if I'd ever be believed again, would be worth something. As for Thomas, I never saw him again. I heard rumors that he moved states, that he was trying to rebuild, that his marriage had crumbled under the weight of everything that surfaced. But I didn't need revenge. I didn't need his apology, because in the end, I got back what mattered: my name, my voice, my life. And I didn't just survive. I inherited justice.